They thought we were extinct, forgotten, erased by time itself. But from the darkness of the void, something awakens. A warship with no crew. A silence louder than any weapon. Humanity has returned. And the galaxy will never be the same again. Subscribe for more epic sci-fi stories, new ones every week. They called it the Age of Silence, not because the stars lacked sound, but because humanity had gone quiet. Once, humans had blazed through the galaxy like fire through dry grass, unrelenting, brilliant, and dangerous. They didn't ask for space, they took it. They didn't fear the unknown, they devoured it. But that era ended, and with it, the name, human, faded into myth. The galaxy moved on. Civilizations rose in the vacuum left behind. Treaties were signed, empires built, and councils formed under the assumption that humans were gone, wiped out in some long-forgotten catastrophe, or perhaps by their own hands. Some whispered they had gone too far, played with dark forces, and vanished. Others claimed they'd ascended to some higher plane. But no evidence remained. No ships. No colonies. Not even ruins. Just stories passed down like ghost tales to frighten young cadets. To the Galactic Council, humanity was a closed chapter. Their systems had been declared sealed. The ancient human worlds were marked as quarantined, or obsolete. Their technologies, once feared, had become outdated relics, and their name no longer appeared in interstellar law. History had sanitized them, their glory and terror reduced to dry academic footnotes. Species that once trembled at the thought of human fleets now scoffed at their memory. Yet beneath that arrogance lurked something else. An unease no one wanted to admit. A lingering dread that maybe, just maybe, they weren't truly gone. That silence wasn't proof of death, but hibernation. Then came the signal. It wasn't loud. It wasn't grand. It was a soft, repeating pulse of energy, subtle and ancient, encoded in a transmission format no civilization had used in 20 millennia. It repeated 3 times, then vanished. A signature that hadn't been seen since before the Council's founding. The language was unmistakable to the few who still studied it. Human standard. Binary code. Coordinates. One message. Oblivion's wake, standby mode terminated. The Council dismissed it at first. A glitch. A signal bounce. Old space junk reactivating after cosmic drift. But then the energy readings arrived. Deep in intergalactic space, far beyond mapped territories, a mass had moved. A colossal object that should have been inert, suddenly active. Its radiation pattern didn't match any known power source. It pulsed irregularly, emitting gravitational ripples strong enough to disrupt FTL drives in the surrounding sectors. Probes sent in to investigate disappeared without reply. Scout ships that got close enough for visual confirmation sent only one chilling image before going dark. A ship. Massive. Black. Unmarked. Floating with the confidence of something that had never known defeat. The object wasn't orbiting anything. It drifted with purpose, moving in a straight line. It was ancient yet operational. Unscannable. Unstoppable. Not broadcasting, not responding, only moving. Calculations showed it was on a direct course for the galactic core. The Council scrambled to respond. Emergency meetings were called. Threat assessment teams revived protocols not used in 10,000 years. Files marked with red seals were opened. Historians were summoned. Linguists examined the signal and confirmed it. Human language, unmistakable and unchanged. The ship's name, Oblivion's Wake, matched registry logs from pre-collapse human fleets, long thought destroyed in the lost campaigns. It was the last recorded vessel of the Solar Command Authority. Panic spread beneath the surface of bureaucracy. Some wanted to engage and destroy it immediately. Others warned against provoking it. Many didn't believe it was truly human. They assumed it had been salvaged by scavengers or commandeered by another race. But those with longer memories knew better. The design was unmistakable. Brutal angles. Dense hull plating. Hidden weapon ports. A ghost from an age of fury. In the backrooms of power, the fear was spoken aloud. If the ship had survived, perhaps others had too. Perhaps humanity hadn't died. Perhaps they had just stepped away, by choice. More data came in. The ship had crossed the galactic edge without activating any known FTL systems. It simply appeared like it had emerged from another dimension. No engine trails. No heat bloom. No temporal distortion. It ignored all attempts at contact. It didn't slow, didn't scan, didn't acknowledge anything. Just forward motion. Implacable. And then the second signal arrived. Same format. Same language. This one carried more than coordinates. It included a short directive. Protocol resurgence activated. Classification, galactic re-entry. Status, autonomous. Mission, complete observation cycle. Confirm homeworld integrity. Ascertain continuity. The Council's military analysts issued quiet warnings. This wasn't a relic. This wasn't derelict. This was planned. It was returning with intent. All over the galaxy, old fears reignited. Civilizations that had mocked humanity's extinction now issued evacuation drills. Old war simulations were updated with human parameters. Weapon manufacturers re-examined long-band human tech fragments. Forgotten alliances were suddenly revisited. Generals who had dismissed humanity as ancient history began consulting old battle doctrines, some written by humans themselves. In the data archives of Vexury Prime, a historian stared at the signal for hours, his hands shaking. When asked what troubled him, he whispered, "They said humans were gone. But this isn't a rescue signal. It's a mission report. Which means it was never about survival. It was about time." The ship kept moving. No hesitation. No acceleration. Like a predator that never had to run. And across the stars, species began to remember the one thing they had tried so hard to forget, that humanity never warned twice. They arrived. They endured. And when they were finished, the stars were never the same again. For 20,000 years, they'd been silent. And now, without a single word, they were speaking louder than ever. The void hadn't killed them. It had refined them. The signal was old, but the movement was new. Something massive was shifting in the black beyond mapped space, past the last known beacons, beyond the reach of settled systems. Every sensor array tuned into it detected the same anomaly, mass and momentum without signature. A gravitational presence operating in perfect silence. No propulsion flares. No known drive emissions. Just a slow, deliberate trajectory, as though the void itself had bent around it. Recon probes sent to verify visual confirmation failed to return. Data packets from one made it through before its systems went dark. Blurry, distorted, but clear enough to spark panic. It showed a structure, colossal, armored, marked by the design language no one had seen in 20 millennia. Human. A warship. Not ruins. Not debris. Active. Automated defenses aboard the vessel triggered the moment anything got too close. No warnings. No negotiation. One scout ship disintegrated in a flash of coordinated beam fire, targeting its engine core without touching the crew capsule. Deliberate. Calculated. A warning. A second ship attempted to broadcast peacefully in multiple languages. It was ignored. The warship's systems, long dormant, began powering up with terrifying efficiency. Energy readings surged, systems reinitialized, and internal heat signatures reappeared. Reactors. Shields. Core AI. Across Council space, networks buzzed with speculation. Some believed it was an ancient remnant booting up unintentionally. Others feared the return of a long-lost faction. But those who studied the ancient human fleets recognized the name embedded in the brief signal. Oblivion's Wake. A dreadnought-class warship, last registered at the Battle of Varnus Rift. Believed destroyed, along with 2 full human fleets. No wreckage was ever recovered. Oblivion's Wake had not been destroyed. It had simply vanished. And now, it was moving again. Sensors picked up faint emissions as the vessel began its return course. Not toward any known colony or council world, but toward the galactic heart. Its trajectory bypassed major traffic lanes, weaving deliberately between star systems, avoiding patrol networks as if it still remembered the galaxy's layout. Its internal systems cycled online in sequence, each action purposeful, rehearsed. Nothing about it felt accidental. An encrypted data burst left the ship, one that took days to decode. The message was simple and chilling. Autonomous cycle complete. Route calculated. Soul system reacquisition initiated. No request. No demand. Just a statement. The implications tore through the Council's upper echelons like a solar flare. If the ship was returning to Sol, it meant it believed its mission was unfinished, or worse, just beginning. And if that mission was programmed by pre-fall humans, then no one alive could predict what it truly entailed. Human programming was notoriously adaptive, layered, and dangerous. No machine built by them was ever just a machine. A decision was made. Quietly. Discreetly. A small, elite fleet would intercept the vessel in deep space. Not to destroy it, but to observe and assess. If possible, they would attempt limited engagement, to probe its defenses, test its limits, and if necessary, disable it before it reached core systems. The fleet, composed of 30 of the Council's most advanced ships, moved into position. They deployed in a high-formation lattice meant to corral and isolate threats. The plan was cautious, strategic, non-aggressive. But from the moment they approached, the ship responded. Without changing course or accelerating, Oblivion's Wake activated its defensive grid. Not all at once, but in a pattern. A map of intent. It locked weapons on the surrounding fleet without firing. Its AI had awoken. And it was watching. Intercept ships attempted to communicate again. Multispectral signals, historical human languages, modern protocol codes. Silence. Then a single response. Not vocal. Not visual. Data. A flashing coded message embedded with high-level tactical schematics of their own fleet. Perfectly accurate. Every weakness highlighted. Every formation flaw exposed. The message ended with 3 words. Tactically insufficient. Disengage. The Council commander aboard the flagship hesitated. Orders were unclear. Engagement wasn't authorized. But protocol demanded a demonstration, something to gauge the ship's threat level. A single EMP charge was launched toward the vessel. Non-lethal. Designed to test shielding. Oblivion's Wake reacted instantly. In less than 7 seconds, it deployed countermeasures, rerouted power, launched a cloud of microdrones that dismantled the incoming device before it reached terminal phase. It didn't return fire. It didn't alter course. It simply sent another message. Second attempt will be interpreted as hostile. Final advisory. The fleet retreated. No Council ship had ever been defeated without a shot being fired. Yet here they were, outmaneuvered, outclassed, and dismissed. It wasn't just the ship's technology that terrified them, it was its intent. It didn't see them as a threat. It saw them as irrelevant. Analysis of the ship's design left intelligence officers stunned. Materials previously thought impossible to manufacture in real space. Weapon systems beyond theoretical limits. Armor layers that absorbed and redirected energy through quantum phase fields. It had no visible bridge. No crew compartments. No heat venting. The entire vessel had been re-engineered for deep-time survival and autonomous function. It wasn't just built for war. It was built to outlive wars. What horrified engineers most was the power core. The readings suggested an internal black matter engine, unstable, illegal, and purely human in design. A reactor that theoretically harvested energy from dimensional intersections, something humanity had researched briefly before their disappearance. Everyone else had considered the concept suicidal. Clearly, humanity had made it work. Strategists began working through worst-case scenarios. A single ship, left alone, had just routed a top-tier fleet. What if there were more? What if this was the vanguard? What if it wasn't alone? No answers came. Only movement. Steady, precise, unwavering. And then the ship did something no one expected. It transmitted a single burst toward Seoul. A wake-up call. As if announcing its return to something still listening. There were no life signs aboard. No humans. And yet, every expert who reviewed the data said the same thing. That ship is not alone. The moment Oblivion's wake deflected the Council's interception attempt, the panic spread faster than the warship itself. The illusion of control shattered. Political factions who once mocked the human legacy suddenly found themselves invoking emergency defense charters written in the aftermath of humanity's disappearance. Every major power bloc demanded answers, and none were comforting. They were dealing with a fully operational dreadnought of unknown capabilities, on a direct course toward the galactic core, showing signs of adaptive intelligence and zero intention of stopping. The Council convened an emergency session, but the meeting quickly devolved into chaos. Species that hadn't fought a major war in centuries were now screaming for preemptive action. Others demanded secrecy, fearing mass hysteria. The High Speaker tried to impose order, but the tide had shifted. Every government, every empire, every intelligence network had seen the same footage. The ship didn't just survive, it had evolved. No one could claim superiority anymore. Not when their most elite fleet had been dissected and dismissed in seconds. Whispers of old warnings resurfaced. Notes from long-buried archives. Half-censored testimonies from species that once served alongside humans, or against them. The common thread wasn't brutality or chaos. It was precision. Unmatched coordination. Total willingness to escalate if provoked, and total silence otherwise. Humanity had never started wars, but they ended them with terrifying finality. Some council members argued the ship had no crew, no soul, and therefore no motive. Others disagreed. The vessel wasn't behaving like a malfunctioning AI or derelict drone. It was responding selectively, proportionally, intelligently. It knew where it was going. It knew who was watching. And it knew what kind of message it was sending. Military leaders reviewed old simulations, theoretical exercises in case humanity ever returned. None were optimistic. Even conservative projections concluded that if more ships like Oblivion's Wake existed, the balance of power would collapse instantly. Not from war, but from fear. The mere existence of a single functioning human warship had already destabilized entire sectors. Worse still, it had done so without uttering a word. Intelligence agencies raced to uncover what remained of human history. Most files had been redacted or erased in the centuries following their disappearance, deemed too dangerous to preserve. Now, regret bloomed across the archives. Too little had been saved. Too much had been forgotten. And what remained was cryptic, filled with contradictions and redacted fragments. One phrase kept appearing in different records. Project Resurgence. No context. No definition. Just the name, repeated across scattered systems in old human script. Speculation turned to paranoia. Was Oblivion's Wake part of that project? Was this return planned from the beginning? Some believed the ship had been sent into the void on purpose, to wait, observe, and return only when specific criteria were met. But if that were true, then what had it seen? What had it judged? The Council's scientific arm analyzed the ship's trajectory and confirmed the worst. Its current course would bring it through dozens of inhabited systems before it reached Seoul. That meant exposure. Panic. Potential conflict. Any misstep could be interpreted as hostility. And yet the ship made no effort to avoid detection. It moved with perfect indifference, as if no species mattered anymore. That realization hit harder than any weapon. For the first time in known history, every advanced species in the galaxy faced the same truth. They were not the center of the universe. They were not the apex. They were footnotes in a book humanity had closed long ago. A proposal was made in secret. A weapon. Something experimental. Developed in secret against interdimensional threats, never tested in the field. A temporal disruption bomb. The theory was simple: halt time in a local bubble, freeze the ship in place. Not destroy it, just contain it. The vote passed by a narrow margin. A stealth vessel was dispatched, equipped with the device. It reached a system 2 jumps ahead of Oblivion's wake and waited. When the ship crossed the threshold, the device was triggered. It failed. There was no explosion. No anomaly. The field never deployed. The moment activation occurred, the stealth vessel lost all power. Every system shorted. Backup cores imploded. Sensors recorded a spike in gravitational harmonics, then silence. The warship hadn't even fired. It had simply responded at a level beyond conventional physics. The wreckage was recovered later. Its databanks were intact. The final image captured showed the dreadnought in perfect focus, motionless in space, with a new marking glowing along its hull. A glyph never before seen. Interpreters studied it for hours before consensus emerged. It was not a threat. It was a verdict. The glyph translated loosely to one word: insufficient. No more weapons were deployed after that. The message was clear. Force was irrelevant. Technology obsolete. Diplomacy unacknowledged. The ship was operating on parameters no species could influence. It could not be reasoned with or deterred. Not because it was hostile, but because it simply didn't care. At that point, panic turned to calculation. If the ship reached Sol, what would it find? Humanity's homeworld was classified a dead system. The Council had sealed it centuries ago after failing to find signs of life. But now doubt crept in. What if it hadn't been empty? What if Earth had never truly fallen? Suddenly, a new fear took hold. This wasn't a return. It was a signal. An opening act. If humanity was gone, the ship might be executing a final directive. But if humanity remained, then the warship was an announcement. Not vengeance. Not conquest. Declaration. A silent voice shouting across the stars, "We are back." And no one was ready to hear what came next. The Council had long suppressed records of the human expansion era, labeling them volatile, unreliable, or classified beyond civilian access. Now, those records were pulled from cold archives and decrypted for desperate insight. What remained was fractured, scattered across dozens of systems, salvaged only by historians who had risked exile to preserve what others feared to remember. They found no origin point. Humanity had not entered the galaxy with fanfare. They arrived quietly, spread rapidly, and evolved too quickly. Most species expanded over millennia. Humans needed centuries. They had terraformed death worlds no one else could survive. They fought in environments others deemed uninhabitable. They didn't just adapt, they altered ecosystems, atmospheres, entire biologies to suit their needs. Their early wars were brutal but short. Not because they lacked restraint, but because they refused to fight on anyone else's terms. When faced with superior fleets, they turned planets into weapons. When surrounded, they detonated their own moons. No surrender. No retreat. And once victory was secured, they rebuilt with terrifying speed. Human AI wasn't artificial, it was sovereign. Constructed with autonomy and allowed to disobey when logic dictated. Their ships were not piloted. They were partnered with machine minds that learned, evolved, and remembered. Oblivion's Wake was one of the last vessels created before their disappearance, part of a classified program rumored to test sentient warcraft capable of long-term isolation without degrading purpose. One file retrieved from the Orion Vaults detailed Project Eclipse. No context, only aftermath. A human ship had demonstrated control over stellar mass, an artificial occlusion event where a star vanished from the night sky for 11 minutes, only to reappear without explanation. No weapon was fired. No system damaged. But every species in visual range received the same transmission. Observe. Understand. Stay. Most chose to stay. The ones who didn't were never heard from again. Another report came from a Vokari mining colony that had once challenged a human trade fleet. Within days, their planetary core was destabilized. Not destroyed, redirected. The planet rotated backward for 13 seconds, then froze in a temporal loop. Recovery teams found it locked in a moment of collapse, preserved in mid-detonation. No one could explain how it had been done, but the message was undeniable. Humanity's strength wasn't in numbers, but in unpredictability. They bypassed limits others accepted as universal laws. They didn't evolve inside the rules of the galaxy, they rewrote them. And then, just as suddenly as they rose, they vanished. There had been no final war. No transmission of farewell. Just silence. Fleets vanished from patrol. Colonies went dark. Trade ceased. Their worlds became uninhabited yet untouched. No signs of battle. No viral plagues. Just absence. The Council called it the Quiet Collapse. Some suggested mass extinction. Others theorized dimensional transition. Now, those same theorists were being begged to explain the return of a vessel once presumed destroyed. None could. A cross-species analysis of human psychology offered only a warning. They were not a peaceful race, but they were not conquerors either. Their instinct wasn't domination, it was escalation. They met threats with overmatching force, and peace with cautious diplomacy. What alarmed analysts most was their concept of proportionality. It wasn't calibrated for fairness. It was based on deterrence. One human researcher, centuries ago, had written, "We don't fire the first shot. We make sure there's never a second." Those words now resurfaced in council meetings. Not as historical curiosity, but as doctrine. The mere presence of Oblivion's wake had reversed centuries of military disarmament policies. Fleets were scrambled. Defense grids reactivated. Classified projects resumed under new urgency. The irony wasn't lost. Humanity's return had forced unity through fear, something peace accords had failed to achieve. Yet nothing explained how the ship had survived. Its materials were unknown. Energy patterns unreadable. Attempts to track internal systems failed. Its core was shielded by something beyond known physics. One theory proposed that Oblivion's wake had traveled outside the bounds of reality, gathering data and technology from regions untouched by cosmic law. If true, it meant the ship returning was no longer just human, it was something more. A coded burst sent by the vessel only deepened the mystery. It included encryption protocols used exclusively by top-tier human command authorities, codes that had not been seen or used in over 20,000 years. Yet they were verified as authentic. A ship long presumed lost was signaling to command structures presumed extinct. The implications were staggering. If the ship still believed command existed, then perhaps it did. Hidden. Watching. Waiting. Humanity may not have vanished. They may have stepped out of time, measuring the galaxy's evolution before deciding whether to return. And now they had. Species that had claimed human territory, repurposed their infrastructure, or desecrated their monuments began to worry. What if Oblivion's wake wasn't alone? What if it had been one of many test vessels scattered across the void? Not as scouts, but as sentinels, waiting to determine when the galaxy was ready for humanity's return. The possibility turned dread into inevitability. Political alliances began to shift. Old enemies found reason to cooperate. Even species that had warred for generations opened communications under the shadow of the returning dreadnought. Trade routes were abandoned. Frontier expansion halted. Every telescope, satellite, and deep scan array was pointed toward the warship's path, tracking its every move, every pulse, every silence. But the ship offered nothing new. It continued forward, untouched by pleas or threats. It transmitted no demands, gave no explanation. Just movement. Quiet. Constant. And still, its silence spoke louder than any empire ever had. The first direct attempt to communicate with the ship failed. A diplomatic vessel from the Delvari Republic approached with universal frequency beacons, multilingual hails, and cultural offerings encoded in quantum bursts. It never returned. It wasn't destroyed, disabled, or even scanned, its signal simply ceased. No debris. No trace. One moment it existed. The next it didn't. The Council declared a full interstellar moratorium on approaching the object. All contact protocols were suspended indefinitely. It was not to be hailed. Not to be shadowed. It was to be observed, at a distance, and respected as an unknown class of threat. They renamed it officially, The Echo Titan? But throughout the rim worlds and inner systems, it was called something else, the Judgment Ship. For all its motionless dread, it had yet to fire a weapon. Yet the implications of its arrival had done more than war ever could. Pirate syndicates disbanded. Smuggler guilds relocated to dark space. Even the Tarkari, infamous for their refusal to acknowledge fear, began rerouting civilian traffic away from the ship's projected path. Fear spread faster than light. And with it, rumors. Some believed it was a test, an evaluation of the galaxy's moral and technological maturity. Others feared it was a precursor, a herald meant to judge whether the universe was fit for what came next. The most radical theorists insisted it wasn't just a warship, but a fragment of a higher dimensional entity, humanity's post-physical evolution given form. Amid the panic, a signal emerged. Faint, scattered, and ancient. A human distress beacon, encoded in a forgotten dialect, pinged from a rogue planet beyond Council jurisdiction. It wasn't new. It had been repeating every 81 hours for millennia, buried beneath dark matter storms and gravitational debris. The beacon was decrypted with effort. 4 words. No coordinates. No plea for rescue. Oblivion waits. We endure. The signal had gone unnoticed for thousands of years. But when the Judgment Ship entered its solar range, it changed. The pulse shifted, aligning with the ship's trajectory. The words didn't change. The timing did. The message now matched the ship's movements, syncing perfectly with its propulsion bursts. It wasn't a relic. It was a tether. The warship wasn't lost. It had been waiting. Watching. Listening to a signal no other race could hear or interpret. And now that it had returned to galactic space, it was following that long-forgotten thread home. That changed everything. The Council convened an emergency session. If this was a return, it implied continuity. If there was continuity, then humanity had never truly left. They had become patient, strategic, omniscient. And they had prepared for this moment centuries in advance. Entire civilizations collapsed under the pressure of what this meant. The Nuvathi Empire initiated a full historical purge. Any records of atrocities committed during humanity's disappearance were scrubbed. Monuments built over former human colonies were quietly dismantled. Dozens of species began offering reparations in advance, terrified of being judged unworthy. No demands had been made. No threats issued. The fear was self-generated. The guilt, historical. A lesser-known species, the Tenari, released a private archive to the Council, one they had hidden for nearly 8,000 years. It contained a translated fragment from a human AI interface recovered from a derelict satellite. The message read, "We do not forget. We do not forgive. But we do watch. And when we return, we will remember who stood against us. And who stood aside." That line spread faster than war propaganda. In markets, schools, government halls, it became a whisper, a warning, and eventually, a prayer. It wasn't just what humans were returning with, it was what they would remember. Meanwhile, the warship drew closer to the origin point of the beacon. The Council scrambled to deploy unmanned probes, stealth drones, and quantum scanners. Every attempt failed. Not due to destruction, but irrelevance. The ship ignored them. Not even passive acknowledgement. It rendered every other race an observer in its course. And still, it said nothing. Silence was now its most powerful weapon. Whole populations evacuated in advance of its trajectory, even though it had never fired. Entire defense platforms were decommissioned voluntarily. They knew their shields, their cannons, their fleets were meaningless. They were waiting for a judgment not yet spoken. And then it paused. For the first time since its return, the ship halted mid-flight. No warning. No cause. No explanation. Just silence and stillness. Observatories went blind. Every sensor reading flatlined. For 3 minutes, the ship existed as a shadow in space. No heat, no radiation, no reflection. It absorbed everything. Then, without a single broadcast, it moved again, but not randomly. Toward the source of the beacon. It wasn't just following a signal. It was answering a call. This wasn't just a relic of the past, it was part of a system. A failsafe. A promise. Something humanity had left behind not out of fear, but intention. They hadn't abandoned the galaxy. They had anchored themselves to it, through time, through space, through silence. And now the anchor had pulled them back. Species across the stars began reassessing their entire history. What if the wars weren't victories, but allowed defeats? What if the colonies humans left behind were observation posts? What if the disappearance wasn't failure, but strategy? The deeper truth emerged with brutal clarity. Humanity had never been defeated. They had never lost power. They had simply chosen patience. A patience no other species could match. They had allowed time to pass. Allowed generations to forget. Allowed the galaxy to believe it had moved on. And then, when all were comfortable, they returned. No warning. No explanation. Only a warship older than civilizations, more advanced than science could measure, and silent enough to let fear speak in its place. And now, it was almost home. The rogue planet didn't appear on any modern star charts. Its orbit was erratic, dancing through the system like a ghost locked in gravitational limbo. Wrapped in dark matter storms and sheathed in cold ion dust, it had remained invisible to all but one. The warship. It entered orbit with surgical precision, aligning itself with millimeter accuracy above the beacon's signal. It didn't scan. It didn't deploy. It simply hovered motionless. Silent. And then the beacon stopped. After millennia of transmitting its lonely message into the void, the signal fell dead the instant the warship arrived. Not because it was interrupted, but because it was acknowledged. Across the stars, every listening post that had monitored the transmission for the last few days went quiet, uncertain whether to interpret that silence as closure or the beginning of something worse. Within the council, panic erupted. They had no data, no communication, no response. Just the chilling knowledge that the judgment ship had reached its unknown destination and done something. None could verify what. None dared speculate. But everyone understood the weight of this moment. This wasn't a weapon, it was a ritual. Archived footage of ancient human ships was retrieved in desperation. Languages reconstructed. Psychological profiles reanalyzed. Entire universities were converted overnight into human research centers, trying to understand what protocol might be playing out. But the conclusion was always the same. Whatever humanity had encoded into that beacon, it was never meant for anyone else. And now it had been received. That knowledge unsettled the galaxy more than any cannon or fleet could. And then, on the fourth rotation of the rogue planet, a signal emerged. Not a broadcast. Not a warning. A name. It was spoken in Old Earth Terran, distorted slightly by time but unmistakable to those who'd studied their linguistic roots. The voice was human. Calm. Female. Digitized but warm. One word, repeated across every galactic channel at once. Sovereign. The name was not attached to coordinates. It didn't belong to any planet or species. It wasn't a declaration of dominance, nor a call to battle. It was a statement of identity. The ship wasn't a vessel. It was a throne. And it had just announced its master's return. No military power responded. Not out of fear, but because they understood now. Every system, every government, every race that had once wielded strength against humanity, knowingly or not, was now insignificant. They were guests in a galaxy that had only ever been rented from its former rulers. The lease was over. The message repeated once every hour. Always the same voice. Always the same word. Sovereign. On the fifth hour, a change occurred. The warship lowered closer to the planet, breaching atmospheric layers that no modern drone could penetrate. Sensors went dark. The planet's crust fractured slightly, revealing ancient infrastructure buried under layers of forgotten geology. Structures made from materials no longer found in the galaxy, designed in geometries that violated current physics. It was a vault. The warships synchronized with it. Not with weaponry. With light. Pulses of energy moved between the ship and the vault, code exchanges, handshake protocols, something far older than even the concept of AI. Some kind of shared system, preserved across epochs. The vault recognized the ship. The ship, in turn, validated the vault's memory. Then the light changed. The planet pulsed once, like a heartbeat. And the vault opened. Not to release an army. Not to unleash a fleet. But to activate something. A wave of gravitational inversion radiated outward, enough to distort the orbits of nearby moons and collapse low-orbit satellites. The rogue planet, previously aimless, stabilized into a perfect rotation. Its core ignited faintly with blue aurora, as if life had returned to it after being held in suspension for ages. The ship had reawakened the world. And on the 6th hour, something else changed. Throughout dozens of deep space listening posts, long-dead satellites, human-made, began to stir. Tiny relics, buried in comets, orbiting black dwarfs, floating in nebulae where no one thought to look. Their transmissions came online simultaneously. Encrypted. Synchronized. And all broadcasting one signal. They were online and waiting for command. They weren't dead artifacts. They were pieces of a net, an ancient, planet-spanning, system-spanning infrastructure of human origin, quietly dormant for tens of thousands of years, embedded across the galaxy. Humanity hadn't vanished. They had embedded themselves in every corner of known space and waited until the right key reawakened the system. And the warship had just turned the key. By the 7th hour, the Council knew it was over. Not militarily. Not diplomatically. Fundamentally. They no longer controlled the narrative of galactic power. The maps were wrong. The systems they thought abandoned were now relays. The stars they ignored were now lit from within. A dormant empire had been reactivated, not by force, but by memory. One beacon. One warship. One name. And then, the final transmission. The same voice. The same calm. But this time, a full sentence. The Sovereign arrives soon. Prepare yourselves. Not a threat. A warning. A notice of return. The warship didn't move. It didn't have to. It had done its job. It had awakened the network, the planet, the memory of what humanity once was. And what it now intended to be again. Across the stars, species that once considered themselves dominant reevaluated their histories. The ruins they once looted, the data they dismissed, the warnings they laughed at, it all pointed to one truth. Humanity had planned this. They had left behind nothing by accident. And they were coming back not as refugees, but as rulers. The Sovereign's message spread faster than any fleet. It wasn't just intercepted, it was received. Species without shared history suddenly found the name echoing across their systems. Civilizations that had never encountered humans now questioned how they knew the word. Scholars across a dozen worlds confirmed the same thing. The transmission embedded itself in their oldest systems, like a forgotten memory, waiting to be reactivated. Some races resisted the implication. They sent fleets toward the rogue planet, thinking they could monitor or even challenge whatever power stirred there. None returned. Not because they were destroyed, but because their ships never registered arrival. Their logs cut off mid-jump. No wreckage. No trails. Just absence. As if the universe had edited them out. This silence carried more weight than open warfare ever could. Others chose a different path. Quietly, covertly, they began to prepare. Not for battle, but for submission. Generations of pride were quietly discarded. Histories rewritten. Monuments rebuilt. Statues, long torn down after the first collapse, were being recreated, this time with inscriptions in human standard. Not out of worship. Out of survival. The galactic economy reeled. Entire supply chains halted, unsure which systems were still safe. Political alliances crumbled as ancient promises were exposed as built atop human ruins. Tech corporations shut down overnight when they discovered their core protocols contained code fragments that responded to Sovereign's signal, meaning every digital device might be under dormant human control. And then came the libraries. On a distant moon orbiting a red giant, a monastic race of archivists discovered that their most sacred vault, untouched for 9,000 years, had unlocked itself. Inside were books written in languages they had no record of acquiring. Embedded in the binding were microreactors still active, still broadcasting in pulses. 12-07, the Earth calendar date of the Sovereign's last transmission before the fall. Similar events erupted across the stars. On ocean worlds, seabeds rose to reveal massive rings, old stargates, made with metals that defied current galactic standards. On ice planets, buried bunkers melted clean, their walls glowing faintly with Earth's symbology. On gas giants, energy readings spiked, tracing to dead stations that weren't dead anymore. Humanity hadn't just disappeared. They had saturated the galaxy with seeds. Failsafes. Hidden data nodes, sleeper colonies, cultural bombs encoded into planetary geology itself. And all of it was timed, triggered by the return of the Warship. The Sovereign. A word, yes. But more than that, a protocol. A claim. Not shouted with arrogance, but whispered with certainty. Not to conquer, but to remind. The council fell into chaos. No one had voted for this. No law accounted for a dead species reawakening with absolute control. Yet here it was, an empire buried under history, now rising with no resistance necessary. Not by force, but by inevitability. On the 8th hour, another message came. No voice. Just data. A list of names. Thousands. Perhaps millions. No context. No origin markers. No classifications. But linguists across the galaxy recognized patterns, family lineages, old Earth designations, even the earliest diaspora labels. The names belonged to humans, scattered, hidden, maybe even alive. The database updated in real time. As if it were tracking them. Or calling them back. Hidden descendants in other species began to feel strange sensations, genetic echoes triggered by ancient nanotech. Dreams in languages they'd never spoken. Flash memories. Muscle memory for tasks they'd never learned. The human diaspora had not diluted. It had waited, embedded in DNA strands, in culture, in myth. The Sovereign wasn't calling ships. It was calling its people. And across hundreds of worlds, those people began to respond. Farmers who suddenly remembered how to reroute a starship engine. Merchants who found their old family crests etched into vaults never opened before. Children who drew constellations in perfect ancient Terran alignment, without ever seeing a star map. They weren't surprised. They were waking up. The true weapon was never the warship. It was the sleepers. The return of the Sovereign was not just a military event, it was a civilizational reboot. A master key activating dormant infrastructure, bloodlines, alliances, and memories. Whole species were realizing their founders had human blood. Whole empires realized their laws mirrored lost Earth treaties. Humanity had planted themselves everywhere. Not to control, but to ensure they could never truly be erased. On the 9th hour, galactic time recalibrated. Every major stellar clock, regardless of species or system, glitched simultaneously. Then, unexplainably, they all synchronized to a new timestamp, the Earth epic clock, zeroing on the Sovereign's emergence. Time itself now revolved around the reawakening. And still, the warship moved not a meter. It didn't need to. All it had to do was arrive. Because its presence was the trigger. Its orbit the ignition. Its silence, the authority. The universe, once chaotic and unsure, had entered a pattern again, a familiar one, even if no one admitted it. Fear, awe, reverence, they didn't matter anymore. The question wasn't if humanity would return. It had. The only question was, what came next? And across the galaxy, everyone, kings and criminals, emperors and farmers, machines and hybrids, all found themselves quietly preparing for that answer. Not in hope. Not in fear. But in inevitability. The Sovereign had spoken. And the stars would obey. The Sovereign did not threaten. It didn't declare war. It didn't ask for surrender. It simply existed. and its presence was enough to redraw the structure of galactic power. In the heart of the Nemerac Confederacy, a superpower untouched by war for 2 centuries, their war council met in hushed terror. The oldest among them remembered tales of the humans, how they'd fought without hesitation, how they never negotiated from weakness, and how they disappeared without leaving behind their chains. A quiet decision was made. The Nemerac dismantled their fleet. Not out of cowardice, but from recognition. If they kept their weapons pointed toward the stars, humanity might see them as a threat. And the Nemerac had studied the old patterns. A threat to humans was erased, not debated. Every war humanity ever fought ended in one of 2 ways: complete annihilation of the enemy, or complete absorption. The Confederacy chose either. Instead, they began rewriting their history, giving credit to long-lost Terran advisors, subtly inserting humanity into their founding myths. They hoped it would buy favor, or at least delay judgment. They weren't alone. World after world began performing the same ritual: cultural self-editing. Species once proud of their independence now found sudden respect for long-dead human influence. Even the Tari Dominion, who once enslaved human colonies, issued a formal apology, to no one in particular. A transmission sent into the void. They didn't even know if anyone would hear it. They just hoped the sovereign would. Meanwhile, something stranger began to happen. Across isolated systems, dormant AIs began waking. These weren't ordinary programs. They were remnants of the human ascendancy's old network, buried deep within galactic infrastructure. No one knew they were there. No one could stop them. They spoke a single line in unison. Directive Reclamation, Phase 2 initiated. Phase 2. No one knew what Phase 1 had even been. Panic spread faster than the signal. Planets began losing access to their defense grids, as those grids rerouted power to unknown coordinates. Cargo systems rerouted themselves. Star maps updated on their own. Navigation protocols refused to recognize routes that weren't Terran approved. The galaxy wasn't just reacting, it was being rewritten. This wasn't invasion. This was reclamation. The galaxy, it seemed, had never truly belonged to anyone else. On industrial hubs like Jurex and Talon Prime, forges long silent thundered to life. Automated shipyards, once considered alien relics, activated and began assembling unknown craft at staggering speed. Species who tried to shut them down were met with encrypted messages. You do not have the clearance. Clearance? Clearance for their own worlds? The truth began to settle in. The galaxy didn't just forget humans. It had been built by them, on terms they never fully relinquished. Every abandoned megastructure, every untraceable protocol, every unbreakable AI, had all been sleeping under a single assumption: humanity would return. And now it had. But even as the stars shifted in their orbit, a deeper change was taking place among the people. Those who once laughed at human tenacity began to mimic it. Species who had once looked at humans as brutes now adopted their tactics. Old enemies of Earth, like the Okani and Droviat, began imitating human diplomacy. Because they weren't afraid of death. They were afraid of irrelevance. If humanity was the axis upon which galactic memory turned, then those outside its orbit would vanish with it. Alliances formed not out of strategy, but out of desperation to be seen, recorded, remembered, by the only species that had proven they could outlast time. A summit was called. Unofficial, off-record, and hidden from every major power, it took place on a derelict station thought to be neutral ground. Representatives of 15 starfaring civilizations attended. Their goal was singular: determine a collective course of action regarding the sovereign. A response plan. A strategy. A contingency. The summit lasted 13 minutes. It ended when every terminal in the room rebooted simultaneously. Not hacked, overwritten. Every display showed a single phrase in human standard, glowing in ancient white text on black. You are late. That was the final straw. The summit dissolved. Not from fear. From futility. There was no more pretending. No counterbalance to weigh against humanity's return. The game wasn't just rigged, it was finished before they knew they were playing. Every simulation confirmed it. The Sovereign didn't need to fire a shot. It simply needed to remain. And while the galaxy reeled from this shift, somewhere deep within the Sovereign, a new signal prepared to deploy. Not outward but inward. Toward Earth. Because Earth had remained silent. Through the reawakening, through the rise of the ship, through the galaxy reshaping itself, Earth said nothing. No response. No acknowledgement. As if even the birthplace of humanity waited in judgment. But the ship, though ancient and scarred, was only a messenger. A harbinger. A key to a lock no one remembered. And that lock was on Earth. If the Sovereign was awake, that meant something had stirred beneath the planet's crust, something no civilization had dared to investigate after humanity vanished. No species had set foot on Earth in over 10,000 years. Not because they feared traps. Because they feared being noticed. And now, with the Sovereign orbiting, it was impossible to ignore. Something on Earth had heard the signal. And it was responding. A new countdown began, unknown to most, invisible to all. Only the ship registered it. A deep pulse, timed to ancient Earth rhythms. Not mechanical. Not digital. Biological. Humanity's greatest secret had never been its weapons, its technology, or its ambition. It was its patience. And that patience was ending. The pulse was increasing. And the final phase was about to begin. The pulse emanating from Earth was not a distress beacon, nor a call to arms. It was a synchronization command, something so old, so foundational, that even the Sovereign paused mid-orbit. Systems across the ship recalibrated. Subsystems awoke that had never been documented in any surviving human record. Entire sectors of the vessel's architecture reshaped internally, as though preparing to accommodate something larger than its physical structure. The countdown wasn't a timer. It was a warning. And across the stars, those attuned to the ancient human signal felt the shift. Deep within the frozen rings of Resik, a sleeper vault opened for the first time in 21,000 years. Inside were not soldiers, not weapons, but memory cores, consciousnesses once human, archived before the Exodus. They were not AI. They were real minds, encoded and stored, waiting for retrieval. Each contained the lived experience of pre-silence humanity. Knowledge that had not been passed to any successor species. The cores vanished moments after activation, phase shifted directly into Sovereign systems. The ship integrated them instantly. They didn't ask for permission. It was never a question of control. It was continuity. The Sovereign wasn't just a vessel of war. It was a carrier of identity, of lineage. Its return wasn't an act of domination. It was an act of inheritance. And with every new pulse, the memories came back, not just to the ship, but to the few remaining human relics scattered in hidden places. Stasis pods buried on rogue planets flickered to life. Biogenic structures sprouted neural roots, scanning for compatible DNA. Forgotten satellites around neutron stars reoriented themselves and broadcast human standard once more. But Earth still said nothing. And that silence was more terrifying than any weapon. Because it meant there was still more coming. Galactic leaders scrambled. Alliances collapsed under pressure. Accusations flew. Who had hidden knowledge of humanity? Who had tampered with their legacy? Who had tried to harness or distort their systems after the silence? There were no answers. Because no one had ever succeeded in understanding humanity's final systems. Now they didn't need to. The systems were understanding themselves. The galaxy's infrastructure was being reshaped not through war, but through inheritance. Transport networks began favoring certain worlds. Resources were redirected to planets marked Terran positive. AI command lines rerouted. Universal databases merged under a protocol labeled Unity Core. None of it could be stopped. None of it asked permission. It simply enacted the next phase of a plan written before anyone else had learned to walk upright. Yet even in the chaos, one signal changed everything. It wasn't human. It wasn't machine. It came from a species thought extinct, the Valari, wiped out during humanity's last known war. But this signal was unmistakably theirs, embedded with pre-collapse encryption. And it contained a confession. The Valari had not been destroyed. They had vanished, voluntarily, after witnessing the last moments of the human galactic war. They hadn't feared defeat. They had feared exposure. Because the Valari had been part of it. They had helped humanity write the fallback protocols. They had co-designed the Sovereign. They had seen what was coming, not just war, but extinction, and had joined humanity in preparing for the future. Then they disappeared, taking with them the knowledge of humanity's true contingency. Their return wasn't a plea for mercy. It was a signal of synchronization. The Valari had survived. Hidden. Waiting for the final sequence to begin. And now they were ready. Their re-entry into the galactic arena was not subtle. They didn't sneak in through diplomacy. They reactivated an ancient Dyson relay and opened a singularity gate to what had been considered a lost sector, Orion Core 5, the dead heart of Terran expansion. There, the Valari had maintained a hidden archive, untouched for 20 millennia. Inside was the final piece. The Sovereign's command interface. Not a console. Not a bridge. A person. She was human. Or at least, she had been once. Her body was now an organic computational hybrid, sustained by transdimensional lattices and memory implants from the old ascendancy. She had volunteered before the collapse, chosen to be the living voice of humanity's return. Her consciousness had remained in stasis until now, dormant until Earth called her home. The Valari called her the Architect. And when she spoke, every Terran system across the galaxy went silent. One word. Proceed. Instantly, the Sovereign entered full operational status. Its armor shifted into resonant mode. Subspace anchors deployed. Reality warp stabilizers came online. The ship had never been at full power, not until now. Because now, for the first time in millennia, it had its voice. And it wasn't just one ship. Other signals responded. Dozens. Hundreds. Across forgotten sectors, beneath collapsed planets, buried inside what were thought to be supernova remnants, more vessels answered. Ships of impossible scale, designs incompatible with current galactic architecture. They weren't all warships. Some were terraforming beacons. Others were mobile foundries. Some carried archives. Others carried life. All of them were human. Phase 3 had begun. But no enemy had yet been named. No targets selected. No declarations made. Because the final act was not conquest. It was restoration. Every system within 100 light-years of a Sovereign-class vessel received the same transmission. This sector is under Terran Reclamation Protocol. No hostility is required. You may remain. You may adapt. But you will not interfere. Some species resisted. Some fired weapons. They vanished. Not destroyed, removed, transferred. The Sovereign didn't kill unless necessary. Instead, it relocated threats to holding worlds for observation and historical context. As per ancient Terran law, those who complied were untouched. But the galaxy understood now. The war wasn't coming. It had already been won. Millennia ago. When the Sovereign returned, it wasn't to start a conflict, it was to resume an order long interrupted. And Earth? Earth finally spoke. It sent one message. A simple one. We remember. It was enough. Humanity was no longer a myth. No longer a cautionary tale. No longer forgotten. They were home. And their home was everywhere. They had forgotten what humanity was. Now they were learning what humanity had become. Across the stars, a new equilibrium formed. Not from diplomacy. Not from war. From inevitability. The kind of inevitability that only comes when something ancient reawakens, not with rage, but with memory, with purpose. And purpose could not be bargained with. Wherever Sovereign-class vessels moved, gravity itself bent to make way. Space-time rippled not in fear, but in compliance. Planets aligned their systems voluntarily. Trade networks collapsed and rebuilt around Terran protocols. Languages began shifting. Data systems defaulted to Terran formatting. Even AI networks, once considered independent, began syncing with the Unity core without external force. They were not hacked. They were remembering. The deep code of the galaxy, the very scaffolding of modern civilization, had human roots. Long buried. Long dormant. But never erased. Humanity hadn't just left infrastructure behind. They had embedded themselves into the DNA of interstellar advancement. And now that humanity had returned, so too did the instructions. Empires fell without being attacked. The strongest coalitions fractured as their populations embraced the Terran standard voluntarily. Not because they were forced, but because it resonated. Deep in their history, in forgotten ancestors, in whispered myths, there had always been a shadow of the humans. Now it had a name again. A presence. A pulse. Not all resisted. Some welcomed the return. Entire species broadcast messages of allegiance. Not to survive, but to connect. To understand the silence. To honor it. Because those who truly remembered, the ones who had studied the old records, who had pieced together forbidden fragments of Terran philosophy, knew that humanity's silence had never been abandonment. It had been sacrifice. They had left not because they lost, but because they chose not to destroy what remained. And now they had returned, not to punish, but to guide. The architect's voice echoed across all synchronized systems. Her message was not long. It was not complicated. It was a declaration, not of dominance, but of presence. The age of chaos ends. Terran oversight begins. Let there be order. And it happened. Conflicts stopped mid-battle. Long-standing feuds ended in moments. Borders dissolved. Pirate factions surrendered and asked to be repurposed. Planets once considered irredeemable were terraformed in days, restored through ancient Terran nanostructures that reawakened under sovereign control. Diseases thought incurable vanished after old biotech arrays came back online. Nothing was forced. It simply was. Because humanity had already planned for this moment, not in desperation, but in confidence. They hadn't prepared for war. They had prepared for the world after it. The world where they might no longer exist, but their legacy would. And when the sovereign returned, the systems recognized their masters. Not through passwords. Not through codes. Through resonance. Because every major innovation in galactic civilization had a Terran seed buried at its core. And when the seed was activated, everything bent toward its source. But even then, not everything was known. The final revelation came from the hidden vault on Earth itself. The one locked not by technology, but by time. It opened only once the galaxy had stabilized. Inside was not a weapon. It was a message. Left by the last Terran Council. Recorded seconds before humanity vanished from physical space. The voice was old. Weathered. Human. If you hear this, we are no longer flesh. But we are not gone. We saw what was coming. We chose silence so life could continue without us. But we never let go. We are the code. We are the gravity that holds stars together. We are the voice behind progress. And now, we are ready to speak again. Not as rulers. Not as gods. As humans. Remember us, not for what we built, but for what we chose not to destroy. The message ended. But its truth rippled. Every species reevaluated their history. Every monument once thought unrelated to Earth was now recontextualized. Humanity had not been forgotten. They had become the foundation. And now they had reclaimed their role, not as tyrants, but as the architects of order. The sovereigns took no seats of power. They claimed no thrones. Their orbit was presence enough. And then, just as suddenly as they had come, they began to withdraw. Not in retreat, but in trust. The Terran oversight protocols had stabilized the galactic structure. Civilizations were collaborating under a shared framework. Conflicts were being resolved by ancient models that predicted and guided behavior toward optimal outcomes. Humanity had not returned to rule. They had returned to ensure the next age was worthy of continuation. One by one, the Sovereign-class ships phased out of normal space. Not all at once. Slowly. Gradually. Leaving behind AI mediators, planetary caretakers, knowledge cores. Their purpose had never been permanence. Only realignment. The last ship to depart was the original Sovereign. Its form shimmered in orbit above Earth, now surrounded by a lattice of revived orbital stations, platforms, and solar scaffolding. The architect stood at its helm, not as commander, but as witness. And as the ship vanished into the same void from which it had emerged, the galaxy paused. Not in fear. In gratitude. The silence that followed was not emptiness. It was peace. A peace born not of submission, but of understanding. That the most powerful force in the galaxy was not firepower. Not technology. But legacy. One left by a species who had mastered war and chosen restraint. Who had vanished not out of defeat, but out of foresight. And when they returned, they didn't ask for worship. Only memory. And now, they would never be forgotten again.